They took his horse without a word, and by sunrise, 200 riders stood outside his cabin like the earth itself had come to collect a debt. Before we go on, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your town or country in the comments. And if you believe justice doesn't always ride with a gun, stay with me. Now back to the story. The wind moved slow across the plains that morning, dragging fine dust along the broken fence line of Caleb Rourke's land, the kind of land men forgot and maps barely remembered, a place where even hope had to work hard to stay alive. Caleb stood in his doorway, one hand resting lightly against the rough wood, boots planted in the dry dirt, eyes fixed on the horizon where the dust hadn't settled right. Something was coming. He could feel it before he saw it. The kind of silence that presses against your chest. The kind that tells you the world is about to change without asking permission. 12 hours earlier, that same land had held nothing but stillness. No riders. No voices. Just a man and the last thing he owned that still breathed. His horse, Whiskey. Whiskey wasn't much to look at if you didn't know him. Lean. Dust-colored. A scar along the flank from a winter that nearly took them both. But to Caleb, that horse was more than muscle and bone. It was distance when distance meant survival. It was company when silence got too loud. It was the last piece of a life that hadn't completely slipped through his fingers. And then she appeared. Not like a storm. Not like trouble. Just there. A figure near the edge of the creek bed, barely holding herself upright, her steps uneven, her eyes scanning the open land like something behind her still existed even when it couldn't be seen. Caleb didn't reach for his gun, didn't speak. He just watched. Because out here, every stranger carried a story, and not all of them were meant to be heard. She made it halfway to his fence before her strength gave out. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a quiet collapse into the dust like the land itself had decided to catch her. He moved then. Slow. Careful. Close enough to see the dirt on her skin, the exhaustion in her breathing, the way her fingers curled weakly. Into the earth like she was trying to hold on to something that wasn't there anymore. She looked at him once. Just once. And in that look, there was no fear. Only urgency. Only one silent question. Help me, or don't. Caleb didn't ask her name. Didn't ask where she came from. He didn't need answers. Not yet. Some choices come before understanding. He turned, walked back to Whiskey, and rested his hand against the horse's neck for a moment longer than usual. The animal shifted under his touch, sensing something different in the air, something final. Easy, boy, Caleb murmured, voice low, steady, like he was speaking more to himself than to the horse. Then he led Whiskey back, helped the girl onto the saddle with careful hands, and stepped back. No instructions. No promises. Just a quiet slap against the horse's flank. Whiskey ran. Fast. Straight into the open horizon, carrying everything Caleb had left that mattered. And just like that, he had nothing. The dust settled. The silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence anymore. Because somewhere beyond the ridge, unseen eyes had watched it all unfold. And as Caleb stood alone in the fading light, he didn't yet know that by morning, the land would remember what he had done. The night did not move the way it used to after the horse was gone. It stretched longer, heavier, like the land itself was waiting for something to answer back. Caleb Rourke sat on the edge of his porch with nothing in his hands and nowhere left to ride. The empty, hitching post creaked in the wind, a hollow sound that kept repeating like a question with no answer. He had made choices before in his life. Hard ones, wrong ones, necessary ones. But none of them had ever left him this exposed, this. Still, every mile of open land around him felt wider now, like distance had lost its meaning without something to carry him through it. He glanced once toward the horizon where Whiskey had disappeared. No dust trail remained, no sign that the world had even noticed, just darkness settling in slow layers, the kind that swallowed shapes and turned everything into memory. Inside the cabin, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The same wooden table, the same tin cup, the same quiet corners. That once felt like refuge now pressed. And on him like walls closing inch by inch. He poured himself water, took a sip, then set it down untouched, his throat dry in a way that had nothing to do with thirst. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint scent of sage and something older, something that did not belong to him. Caleb stood still, listening, not for sound but for absence, because out here, silence always meant something. and tonight it meant he was no longer alone. He stepped off the porch, boots meeting the dirt, with a soft crunch, and looked toward the ridge line. Nothing moved, not a shadow, not a flicker, but the feeling stayed, watching, waiting, measuring. He exhaled slowly, steady, the way a man does when he knows the next moment might matter more than the last. Hours passed without shape. The stars climbed higher, sharp and cold, marking time without mercy. Caleb did not sleep. He leaned against the porch post, eyes half open, mind tracing the same path again and again, the girl's face, the way she had looked at him, not afraid, not grateful, just certain, as if she already knew what his answer would be before he did. That look stayed with him, heavier than the loss, heavier than the silence. Somewhere past midnight, the wind died completely, and that was when it changed. The stillness deepened, thick enough to feel like the moment before rain that never comes. Caleb straightened slightly, every sense narrowing, and then he heard it. Not loud, not close, just a faint rhythm carried across miles of open ground. Hooves, distant, controlled, not the wild scatter of riders chasing something, but the measured approach of something that already knew where it was going. Caleb did not reach for a weapon. He did not move at all, because some things, once set in motion, could not be stopped by force. The sound faded, then returned, closer now, enough to stir the dust along the far edge of his land. He watched the darkness there, waiting for shape to form, for meaning to reveal itself, but nothing came. Not yet. Only the promise of arrival, the kind that does not ask permission, the kind that remembers what a man has done even when he tries not to. Caleb remained where he was until the first hint of gray touched the sky, until the night loosened its grip just enough for the world to be seen again. And that was when he noticed the ground itself had changed, faint lines in the dust, too many to count, too deliberate to ignore, leading straight toward his home. He followed them with his eyes, slow, careful, and understood something before the sun even broke the horizon. Whatever was coming was not lost. It was not searching. It was already here. The first light of morning did not arrive gently. It cut across the land in thin silver lines, revealing what the darkness had been hiding. And Caleb Rourke stood there without moving, his eyes following the marks in the dust that had not been there the night before. Dozens at first glance, then more, layered over each other in a pattern too precise to ignore. Hoofprints, many of them, all facing one direction, all leading to him. He did not crouch, did not reach down to touch them. He did not need to. A man who had spent his life on open land learned to read the ground the way others read letters. And this was not a trail. It was a message. He lifted his gaze slowly toward the horizon, the pale light stretching farther now. And there, just beyond the ridge, something shifted, not fast, not sudden, but enough to break the stillness, a line forming where there should have been none. He narrowed his eyes, breath steady, and waited, because whatever was coming had already chosen its pace. And it was not in a hurry. Minutes passed like held breath, the kind that makes your chest tighten without warning. And then the shapes began to separate from the horizon. One rider, then another, then 10, then more, until the land itself seemed to move, a slow wave of figures emerging through the dust, their outlines sharp against the rising sun. Caleb did not count them at first. Counting would have meant disbelief, and there was no room for that now. He stepped forward once, just enough to feel the ground under his boots, solid, real, unchanged. Beneath everything that was unfolding, the riders did not break formation. They did not rush. Each one held their place as if guided by something older than command. The distance closed, yard by yard, until the sound reached him, not loud, not chaotic, but steady, controlled. The rhythm of hooves striking earth in unison, a sound that did not threaten, but did not ask permission either. Caleb's hand rested lightly at his side, empty, open. He did not reach for anything else, because something in the way they moved told him this was not about force. This was about meaning. The first rider came into full view, then the next, and the next, until there was no space left between them. A line stretching wide across his land, more than he could take in with a single glance. 100, then more, then still more, until the number stopped mattering and only the presence remained. They stopped as one, not a moment early, not a moment late. The sound of hooves faded into nothing, and the silence that followed was heavier than any noise Caleb had ever heard. No one spoke. No one reached for anything. They simply sat there, facing him, waiting, measuring, and Caleb felt it then. Not fear, not exactly, but the weight of being seen completely, the kind of attention that does not look at what you are, but what you have done. The front rider shifted slightly, and Caleb's breath caught for the first time, because behind that figure, just beyond the line, stood a shape he recognized without needing to see it clearly, the outline of a horse, familiar in a way that reached deeper than sight. His eyes moved there slowly, carefully, and the world narrowed to that single point. The horse stepped forward one pace, then another, and the morning light caught along its flank, revealing the scar he knew by heart, the curve of muscle, the steady way it held its head. Whiskey returned, but not as he had left him. Something had changed. The animal stood taller, cleaner, a strip of cloth draped across its back, woven patterns catching the light in quiet colors that did not belong to Caleb's world. And behind the horse, she appeared, stepping forward into the open space between him and the riders. The same girl, but no longer carried by exhaustion, her posture straight, her gaze steady. And in that moment, Caleb understood something without words. This was not an accident. This was not chance. This was something chosen, something returned, something that had followed him back across the distance he thought he had lost. The riders remained still. The wind barely touched the edges of their presence, and the girl stopped just short of the space where his land began, her eyes meeting his, not asking, not thanking, simply acknowledging, as if the moment itself was enough. And Caleb realized he was no longer standing alone on forgotten ground, because whatever had come with the dawn had come for him. No one spoke, and that was the first thing Caleb understood. This was not a meeting, not a negotiation, not even a confrontation. This was something else entirely, something that did not need words to carry its weight. The girl stood there between him and the riders, the morning light catching in her dark hair, her presence steady in a way that did not belong to someone who had been barely standing the day before. She took one step forward, then another, slow, deliberate, until she reached the invisible line where his land began, and there she stopped, not crossing it, not yet. Caleb did not move to meet her. He stayed where he was, shoulders squared, breathing even, because some distances were not meant to be closed too quickly. She lifted her hand slightly, palm open, not as a gesture of request, but of acknowledgement, and behind her, the riders shifted in the smallest way, not breaking formation, just enough to show they were part of something larger than any one of them. Caleb's eyes moved again to the horse, to Whiskey, standing calm, almost proud, the cloth across its back woven with patterns he had never seen before, colors muted but precise, each thread placed with intention. This was not decoration. This was meaning. He could feel it without understanding it. The girl turned her head slightly, speaking a few quiet words over her shoulder, not loud enough for Caleb to hear. But the effect was immediate. The rider closest to her stepped forward, leading Whiskey by the reins. The horse did not resist, did not hesitate. It walked with the same steady rhythm Caleb remembered, but there was something different in its movement now, something grounded, as if it carried more than just itself. The rider stopped a few feet away from Caleb, then released the reins without a word, stepping back into line. And just like that, the horse stood between them, belonging to no one for a single, suspended moment. Caleb's hand twitched slightly at his side, instinct pulling him forward, but he did not reach out yet, not until he understood what was being given. Because this was not simply a return, this was something else, something heavier. The girl's voice came then, soft, clear, carrying across the space without force. He knew the way, she said, her English careful but certain. Caleb's gaze lifted to meet hers, and in her eyes, he saw not gratitude, not relief, but recognition, the kind that does not come from a single act, but from something deeper, something carried. You did not ask who I was, she continued, her voice steady. You did not ask what would follow. Caleb swallowed once, slow, his throat dry again, but not from fear, from the weight of the moment settling into him. He shook his head slightly, not as an answer, but as a truth. She nodded once, as if that was enough, then reached to the side of the horse, her fingers brushing lightly against the cloth, From beneath it, she drew a small object, a piece of leather wrapped tight, worn at the edges but carefully kept. She stepped forward one more pace and extended it toward him, stopping just short of placing it in his hand. Caleb looked at it, then back at her, a question forming that he did not speak. She held his gaze and said quietly, "You gave what you could not replace." The words hung there, simple, but heavier than anything else that morning. Caleb reached out then, slowly, his fingers closing around the leather. It was warm, not from the sun, but from having been held, carried, kept. He did not open it, not yet, because something told him the meaning was not inside the object, but in the act of receiving it. Behind her, the riders remained still, silent as the land itself, and Caleb realized then that they were not waiting for him to speak. They were waiting for him to understand. The girl stepped back once more, returning to her place before the line, her posture unchanged, her presence unwavering, and in that quiet space between them, with the horse standing calm and the leather bundle resting in his hand, Caleb felt the shift complete. Whatever this was, whatever it meant, it was no longer about what he had lost. It was about what had found its way back to him, and why it had chosen to return. Caleb did not open the leather bundle right away. He just stood there with it resting in his palm, feeling its weight, not heavy in size but heavy in meaning, the kind of weight that settles into a man slowly, like truth that takes its time to arrive. Whiskey shifted beside him, letting out a quiet breath, the familiar sound grounding him just enough to move again. He reached up and rested his hand along the horse's neck, fingers brushing through the coarse hair, and for a moment the world narrowed to that simple contact. Something returned, something restored, but not unchanged, never unchanged. He finally looked down at the bundle again, turning it slightly in his hand, the leather worn smooth in places, marked by time and care, not something discarded, not something given lightly. He loosened the wrap slowly, careful, as if whatever was inside required respect before it even revealed itself. The flap opened, and within it lay a small piece of carved stone, simple at first glance, no shine, no decoration that called attention to itself. But the longer he looked, the more it held, etched lines, precise, deliberate, forming a pattern he did not recognize but felt he should, like a word half remembered from a dream. Caleb lifted it slightly, turning it toward the light, the morning sun catching along its edges, and for a brief second, something shifted in his chest. Not understanding, not yet, but recognition of something beyond him, something that did not belong to his world but had still found its way into his hands. He glanced up at the girl, his eyes asking what his voice did not. She watched him steadily, her expression unchanged, but there was something softer now, not in weakness, but in certainty. "It was carried before you," she said quietly, her voice moving through the still air without breaking it. Caleb's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in the effort to listen deeper. She stepped forward again, just one pace, enough to close the distance by inches, not yards. "And it will be carried after," she added, her words settling between them like something placed carefully, not forced, not explained. Caleb looked back at the stone, then out toward the riders, their silence unbroken, their presence unwavering. He realized then that none of them were watching the horse. None of them were watching the land. They were watching him, not as a threat, not as a stranger, but as someone who had stepped into something without knowing it, and now stood at the edge of understanding it. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him steady, controlled, and in that moment, the emptiness he had felt the night before shifted, not gone, but no longer hollow. It had shape now, direction. The girl turned her head slightly once more, another quiet exchange of words passing between her and the riders. And this time, the response was different. One by one, the riders behind her began to move, not forward, not toward him, but outward, splitting apart in two silent lines, creating space where there had been none. The movement was slow, deliberate, like something practiced over generations, not a show, not a display, but a ritual. Caleb watched it unfold, his grip tightening slightly around the stone, because whatever this was, it was not finished, not yet. The lines widened, stretching across his land, revealing more figures behind them, more horses, more presence than he had first seen, and with that opening, The girl stepped back into the space they had made, her gaze never leaving his. "You gave without asking," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach him clearly. "So now you will receive without knowing." Caleb felt the words settle deeper than the others. Not confusing, not threatening, but undeniable, the kind of statement that does not explain itself because it does not need to. He stood there, the horse beside him, the stone in his hand, the land no longer empty, and understood something he had not expected. Whatever had come to his door that morning was not finished giving. The space they opened did not feel empty. It felt prepared, like a place waiting for something that had not yet arrived. Caleb stood still as the two lines of riders stretched wider across his land, revealing more than he had first seen, not just numbers, but intention, every horse placed with purpose, every rider holding a position that meant something beyond simple presence. Whiskey shifted beside him again, ears flicking toward the movement, but did not step away, as if the horse understood something Caleb was only beginning to grasp. The girl remained where she was, centered between the parted lines, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath with her. Then the first of them moved, not forward, not toward him, but into the space between the lines, a single rider guiding a horse slowly, deliberately, the animal's coat catching the morning light, different from Whiskey, stronger in build, well kept, its movements controlled with quiet confidence. The rider stopped halfway, then dismounted without a word, removing the reins and letting them fall loosely against the horse's neck before stepping back, returning to the line without looking at Caleb. The horse remained, standing alone in the open space, calm, waiting. Caleb's eyes followed the motion without shifting his stance, his hand still holding the carved stone, his other resting lightly against Whiskey, grounding himself in something familiar while the unfamiliar continued to unfold. Then another rider stepped forward, mirroring the first, another horse. Another quiet offering placed in the space, then another, and another, until the pattern became clear, not random, not symbolic alone, but real, tangible, undeniable. One horse became two, then three, then five, each one stepping into the space and remaining, forming a quiet line that grew with each passing moment. Caleb felt something shift again, deeper this time, not confusion, not disbelief, but the slow realization that what stood before him was not just acknowledgement, it was multiplication. What he had given had not returned the same. It had expanded, grown into something larger than its beginning. The girl spoke again, her voice steady, carrying just enough to reach him without breaking the stillness. "A man who gives with empty hands," she said, pausing slightly as the next rider stepped forward, "does not leave empty." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in the effort to hold the weight of what was happening. The horses continued to come, 10, now, then more, their presence filling the space with quiet strength. No noise beyond the soft shifting of hooves against dirt, no display, no demand, just arrival. Caleb glanced once at the stone in his hand, then back at the growing line, and understood something that settled into him without needing to be spoken. This was not charity. This was not repayment. This was recognition. The kind that does not measure value by equal exchange, but by what something becomes after it is given freely. The final rider stepped forward, slower than the others, older in presence, his movements carrying a weight that did not need to be announced. He guided a larger horse into the line, one that stood taller than the rest, its coat dark, its posture calm but commanding. When he dismounted, he did not step back immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward Caleb, his eyes meeting his for the first time among all of them. And in that look, there was no judgment, no question, only certainty. The man gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then stepped back into place, the line complete, the space filled. Caleb stood there, surrounded not by threat, not by expectation, but by something far more unfamiliar, something that did not ask him to prove anything, only to accept what had been placed before him. Whiskey let out a slow breath beside him, and Caleb finally moved, one step forward, not toward the riders, not toward the girl, but toward the space they had created, toward what had been given. And as his boots met the ground between the horses, he realized the silence had changed again, It no longer pressed against him. It held him, steady, like something that had already decided where he belonged within it. Caleb's boots pressed deeper into the dust as he stepped between the horses, and for the first time that morning, he felt the ground answer him back, not as empty land, not as something abandoned, but as something that now held weight beyond his own. Footsteps. The horses did not shy away from him, did not shift or pull back. They stood as if they had been waiting for him specifically, each one calm, steady, breathing slow in the quiet air. He moved past the first, then the second, his hand brushing lightly against their necks as he passed, not claiming them, not testing them, just acknowledging their presence the same way they had acknowledged his. Behind him, the riders remained still, their silence unbroken, their attention unchanged, not watching with suspicion, not watching with expectation, but with something far more unfamiliar to Caleb, something closer to acceptance. He stopped near the center of the line, turning slightly to take in the full span of what had been placed before him. More than a dozen now, strong animals, well kept, each one carrying a quiet strength that spoke of care, of purpose, of belonging. And yet here they stood, placed on his land as if they had always been meant to be here. Caleb let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening slightly around the carved stone still resting in his hand. He lifted it again, turning it once more in the light, and this time, something shifted, not in the stone, but in him. The pattern made more sense now, not fully, not clearly, but enough to feel its direction, lines crossing and returning, not random, not decorative, but intentional, like paths that meet again after being lost. He lowered it slowly, his gaze moving back to the girl. She had not moved, still standing at the edge of his land, still holding that same steady posture. But now there was something else in her presence, something quieter, as if what needed to be shown had already been placed in front of him, and what remained was his to understand on his own. Caleb took another step forward, then another, until he stood beside the largest horse in the line, the one the older rider had brought. The animal turned its head slightly toward him, not resisting, not testing, just aware. Caleb reached out slowly, his hand resting against its neck, feeling the warmth beneath his palm, the steady rhythm of its breathing. And in that moment, something inside him settled, not resolved, not complete, but aligned, like a piece of something long misplaced finding its way back into position. He closed his eyes briefly, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement, then opened them again, looking out across the land that no longer felt as empty as it had the day before. Behind him, Whiskey remained where he had left him, calm, steady, unchanged in presence but changed in meaning. Caleb turned slightly, glancing back once, and for the first time since the riders had arrived, he allowed himself to understand something simple. He had not lost anything the day before, not truly. He had only let something go so it could return as something else, something larger, something that did not belong only to him anymore. The girl stepped forward then, just one pace, her voice carrying across the space with the same quiet certainty as before. "It is not what you take," she said, her eyes meeting his again. "It is what stays." Caleb held her gaze, the words settling into him without resistance, without question, because they did not ask to be understood, only to be accepted. The wind moved again, soft this time, carrying the scent of dust and leather and something older, something that felt like memory. And as Caleb stood there, surrounded not by silence, but by presence, he realized something else had changed. Not the land, not the riders, not even the horses, but him. The man who had stood alone the night before was no longer standing in the same place, even if his boots had not moved far, because what had arrived with the dawn had not just filled the space around him, it had filled the space within him. And for the first time and longer than he could remember, Caleb did not feel like he was waiting for something to come. He felt like he had already been found. The wind shifted again, softer now, carrying a warmth that had not been there before. And Caleb Rourke stood among the horses without moving, as if stepping any further might disturb something that had already found its place. The carved stone rested in his hand, no longer unfamiliar, no longer distant, but not yet fully his either. The lines etched into it seemed clearer now in the rising light, not because they had changed, but because he had. He lifted it once more, holding it at eye level, and for a moment the world around him blurred, not fading, but quieting. Like everything else had stepped back to let him see, the lines curved and crossed, forming shapes that did not belong to maps or fences. They spoke of movement, of return, of paths that never truly ended. Caleb lowered the stone slowly, his gaze shifting to the girl once more. She had stepped closer now, not far, but enough to stand just inside the edge of his land, the boundary no longer holding her back. Her presence there felt natural, not as an intrusion, but as something that had always been allowed. She looked at the horses, then back at him, and there was something different in her eyes now, not just recognition, but something like quiet approval. "You see it now," she said, not as a question, but as a statement that did not require confirmation. Caleb nodded once, slowly, not because he understood everything, but because he understood enough to know that this moment was not about answers. It was about acceptance. The riders behind her remained still, their formation unchanged, but the air between them had shifted, lighter now, as if something had been completed without needing to be announced. Caleb took a step forward, then another, moving through the line of horses until he stood closer to her than before. The space between them smaller now, not measured in distance, but in meaning. He held the stone out slightly, not offering it back, not rejecting it, simply acknowledging its place between them. "What is it meant for?" he asked quietly, his voice steady, carrying no demand, only curiosity shaped by respect. The girl looked at the stone, then back at him, her expression unchanged but her voice softer this time. "It is not meant for you," she said, and the words did not land as refusal, they landed as truth. Caleb did not pull his hand back, did not question her meaning. He simply waited, because something told him there was more. She took one more step forward, closing the space just enough, and gently turned his hand so the stone rested fully in his palm, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment, not lingering, not hesitant, just certain. "It is meant through you," she added, and the meaning settled deeper than any explanation could have carried. Caleb's breath slowed, his gaze shifting past her for a moment, taking in the riders, the horses, the land that no longer felt empty, and understood something that had not been spoken but had been shown from the moment the first hoofprint appeared in the dust. This was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something that would move beyond him, beyond this land, beyond even this moment. He lowered his hand slowly, the stone now resting against his side, no longer a question, but a responsibility. The girl stepped back then, returning to her place before the riders. Her role in the moment complete, the silence returned once more, but it was no longer heavy, no longer waiting. It was settled, like a story that had found its direction, and as Caleb stood there, surrounded by what had been given and what had yet to come, he realized that what had arrived at his door that morning had not come to repay him. It had come to change him, and that change was not something he could hold in his hands. It was something he would have to carry forward, long after the dust had settled and the riders had gone. The riders did not leave right away, and that was the last thing Caleb Rourke noticed before everything changed again, not in movement, not in sound, but in meaning. The girl stood where she had returned, her place now no longer between him and them, but within them, as if the line had never truly been separate. The horses remained calm, their presence steady, no longer arrivals but part of the land itself. And Caleb stood there with the carved stone resting against his palm, feeling its edges press lightly into his skin, not demanding, not guiding, just present. He looked out across the riders one more time, taking in the stillness, the quiet strength of men who had not come to take anything, only to place something where it belonged. And then, without a signal, without a word, the first rider turned, not sharply, not abruptly, but with the same deliberate motion that had brought them there, his horse stepping back into the open plain, followed by another, and another, until the line began to fold into itself, dissolving not into chaos, but into distance, the kind that returns things to where they came from without erasing what they left behind. Caleb did not move to stop them, did not call out, because something in him understood that nothing was being taken away. Not really. The horses that had been placed before him remained, steady and grounded, and even as the riders disappeared beyond the ridge, their presence did not vanish. It settled into the space they had shaped, into the dust, into the silence that no longer felt empty. The girl was the last to turn, her eyes meeting his once more, holding there for a moment longer than before, and in that look, there was no farewell, no promise, only recognition, the kind that does not need to return because it never truly leaves. She gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then turned and followed the others, her figure becoming part of the horizon until she was no longer visible. Caleb remained where he was, the wind moving softly again, carrying the faint sound of hooves fading into the distance. He stood there for a long time after they were gone, not counting the minutes, not measuring the change, just letting it settle. The horses shifted around him, adjusting to their new place, not restless, not uncertain, just present, as if they had always been there. Whiskey stepped closer, nudging lightly against his shoulder, and Caleb let out a slow breath, his hand moving instinctively to rest against the familiar warmth. He looked down at the carved stone once more, turning it in his hand, the lines now clear in a way they had not been before, not because they had changed, but because he no longer needed them to explain themselves. He understood enough to know that what he held was not something to keep, not something to hide, but something to carry forward, something that would shape the steps he took from this moment on. He slipped it carefully into his pocket, not as possession, but as acknowledgement, then lifted his gaze across the land, his land, though it did not feel like it belonged only to him anymore. The fences still stood, the cabin still weathered, the same wind moved across the same ground. But something had shifted beneath it all, something quiet and unshakable. Caleb reached for the reins of the nearest horse, not Whiskey, but one of the new ones, his fingers closing around the leather with a steady grip. He did not hesitate, did not question. He simply stepped forward, leading it a few paces, testing nothing, proving nothing, just beginning. Because that was what this moment had become, not an ending, not a reward, but a beginning. And as the sun climbed higher over the plains, casting long light across the land that had once been empty, Caleb Rourke walked forward with something he had not carried in years, not wealth, not power, but direction. And out here, where silence spoke louder than words, that was the only kind of justice that ever truly lasted.